Hi everyone, my name's Jamie. I'm a pantomime producer. I started out though as a stagehand. I was in the backstage crew of the pantomimes at the Hazlitt Theatre in Maidstone for a few years before getting my first on-stage gig as a performer. My first panto was as Aladdin, playing alongside my good friend Steve Hewlett. We did our first ever panto, both of us together. And then I was in pantomimes around the country, Southport, Torquay, summer touring pantomimes in Scotland and on the south coast, shows all over the country before settling on producing and directing. And now I produce just one show a year at the Stag Theatre in Sevenoaks. The Panto Archive have asked me to answer 5 questions for their Q&A programme, so here are my answers. Question 1 is about pantomime being politically correct and whether or not it's had to change in recent years so as not to offend anyone. Well, I suppose the first thing is that it's impossible not to offend everyone. Some people get offended for all sorts of odd reasons. I think it's important the intention is never to offend anyone, but always just to create a show that's as entertaining for a 70-year-old as it is for a 7-year-old, with everyone in between. A few times our show in Sevenoaks has caused offence that you couldn't really predict. A few years ago, we had a couple of complaints that our cast was too black, and I wrote a response that hit the headlines for a while. We obviously had offended someone. They thought that there should have been more white people in the show than black people. We hadn't noticed on the poster that that was the case. So that's the kind of offence I'm happy to create, I suppose. And then in more recent years, Danny Beard, the wonderful drag performer Danny Beard, played in Sevenoaks for us for 3 years in a row. And again, there was a little bit of fuss when a newspaper journalist, a local journalist, referred to him as a gender fluid dame. I mean, gender is fairly fluid in Panto at the best of times. Danny, for anyone who knows him, is a drag performer with facial hair. As far as I was concerned, he was playing, in the year that he did play Dame, he was playing Aladdin's mum. And whether that was male or female, whether he was wearing trousers or frocks, whether he was wearing a wig or a beard, didn't really matter to me. It certainly didn't matter to the audience. So, yes, I suppose my answer is that pantomime always has to change. It should always be updating itself. It should never be trying to offend, but if occasionally people are offended, that's okay. Question 2 is about revisiting old titles, so slightly less popular titles like Mother Goose, Goldilocks coming back into fashion. We did Mother Goose for the first and actually only time in 2011 when Robert Pierce, the first Dame we really worked with, played a fantastic Mother Goose. It's a great show, slightly edgier. Naturally, the story is a little bit edgier than most other titles, and it's certainly something I would go back and do again. Robin Hood and the Babes in the Wood is another one that we did when it wasn't quite so popular, coming back into vogue now. I thought that the Goldilocks that the Palladium did just last year, the Kudos show, was great. There are shows that I don't even know the story to. Puss in Boots, I don't really know. Robinson Crusoe, I kind of get that mixed up. It's very similar to Dick Whittington, I think. I like the boy titles very much. I like Dick Whittington, Jack and the Beanstalk, Aladdin. But our plans moving forward after we've tried to do this Jack and the 2-metre Beanstalk this year are to tackle Alice in Wonderland and Treasure Island, both shows that we tried to tour when we were looking at doing Easter pantomimes a few years ago. But I'm looking forward to doing Alice in Wonderland and Treasure Island properly on stage at the Stag in the next 2 years. The next question is about casting. So if money was no object, who would I cast in a pantomime? Karen from Will and Grace. In fact, the entire cast of Will and Grace would be great. They'd be perfect in a pantomime. But Karen, and Megan Mullally, who plays Karen, I wouldn't want her to do something clever with the role. I just want her to be Karen. in whichever part she liked. She could play baddie, she could play Cinderella, for all I care. It would be hilarious. Question 4. Did I watch pantomime as a child, and what's my earliest memory? My earliest memory of pantomime, my mum took me to see Lulu as Peter Pan in, I think it must have been 1988 or 1999, in Wimbledon. And I was very excited. She told me she'd got 2 tickets in the stalls, but it was one of my first times visiting the theatre, and in my mind, the stalls, for some reason, looked like a farmyard, like an animal stall, and so I insisted on wearing my oldest clothes and a pair of Wellington boots, which my mum let me do. I guess there was no point arguing. But when we got there, I think that the stewards took pity on us, maybe thought I was a crazy kid, or just thought I was cute in my Wellington boots. And so we were upgraded to a box in Wimbledon. And so in my wellies, I watched Lulu play Peter Pan. But my most significant memory is then in the early 90s, my mum and godmother took me to see Peter Pan in Reading at the Hexagon Theatre, which was, I think, an early John Conway production. I was very young, maybe 13 or 14, but that specific show is what inspired me to be in pantomimes, to write, to direct pantomimes at a young age. As a young teenager, I started writing little pantomimes for local youth groups, and that show really inspired me. It was a show that starred Leslie Grantham. I think it was one of his first hooks, first of many, playing Captain Hook for John. Bernie Clifton was also in the show, Una Stubbs, Michaela Strachan, and I loved the show so much that at the end I made my mum buy me a programme and take me to Stage Door, where I met Leslie and got his autograph. I dug out, this is the programme. People that knew me and Leslie working together know this. There's his autograph there. Know this story because I would tell it on the gala nights of our pantomimes, the ones that Leslie was involved with every year. But essentially, I met Leslie, got his autograph, was starstruck, and decided that pantomime was for me on that day. Many years later, sometime in 2011, his agent called me and asked me if I wanted to cast him in one of my shows. I couldn't believe it. I learned a lot from John Conway when I worked for a short time for Kudos. I learned a lot from Leslie in the many years that I was lucky enough to work with him between 2011 and when he died a couple of years ago. But it's a very odd thing when, as a kid, you go to see a show and queue up at Stage Door and get someone's autograph, and then you do a job inspired by that event, and then the person that inspired you then becomes your friend and advisor for many years. So the most important pantomime memory I have is the Hexagon in Reading and that Peter Pan. And finally, question 5. Can I tell you a bit more about trying to stage a pantomime in a pandemic? Yes, I can. At the Stag Theatre, we're going to be presenting Jack and the 2-metre beanstalk. I gave myself a plug just here. Took me about half an hour to get that on the telly. I'm very pleased with myself. For the cast, it will be a big commitment. We're asking them to test for COVID-19 2 weeks before the first rehearsal, then self-isolate for 2 weeks. During rehearsals and the run of the show, to create a bubble that is their house, where they live, and the show, not to see friends and family over Christmas, not to go to restaurants, pubs, bars, anywhere where the trace and track programme might mean they have to self-isolate and we lose a cast member. To be ready to perform the show sometimes 3 times a day, sometimes 4 times a day, so that we can maximise the capacity in the auditorium. It's going to be a lot of hard work, and they will have to give up a lot. For the crew, the small crew that we're able to bring onto the show, similarly, they'll have to do a lot of self-isolating. They'll have to keep their distance from the cast. We'll also be asking them to minimise their social contacts over the course of the rehearsals and the show itself. For the last 3 years, we've built our entire set out of LED video wall, so we don't need a big cast to bring lots of set on, take it off. We're lucky that we can go anywhere, animate any scene, travel to whatever place we need to without massive set changes. So it will be a crew of 3 or 4 rather than 10 that we might normally have. For the audience, though, we're hoping that the show is as close to a normal year as possible. Our production values will stay as high as we can get them. It will be a 90-minute show with no interval, because audience handling in intervals is quite difficult. Our audiences will have to wear a mask because that's what current government guidance says you need to do in a theatre. We would normally sell between 21 and 22,000 tickets each year at the Stag. There'll only be 8,000 tickets on sale, so our audiences who come back again and again, many of them won't be able to see the show this year, so we're looking at doing some live streaming as well. There's a lot of planning in place. There's a lot that you have to assume might go wrong and then plan for. Local lockdown, national lockdown, infection within the cast. We need to protect against all of those things. For any venue, any producer that's decided not to do Panto this year, it is the obvious choice in a lot of ways. It's going to be really very challenging because we're small and we're flexible and we only have one venue. We can put our hearts and souls into it and try and make it work. For anyone who's not doing Panto, artists, producers, musicians, crew, my heart goes out to everyone. It's been a terrible year. 2020 is really not the one. And I'm sure you'll all come back stronger in 2021. For those venues that are trying to do something, good on you. I wish you the best of luck. We're going to do what we can to stage a show this year, and maybe we'll see you in the audience. But we won't be able to say hi at stage door because we're in a bubble.